For more, let's cross to Bogota and Elizabeth Dickinson, senior analyst at International Crisis Group. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24.
I really appreciate the invitation. Thank you.
Do we know any more about these civilians who fired on protesters last Friday in Cali?
So I think we're all waiting to see the results of this investigation, and it is certainly a positive step that they're moving forward there. This is not the first time that this has happened. Early in the protests around May 9th, so we're talking about 10 days into the protest, there was a similar incident where seemingly very organized civilians had similarly acted against members of indigenous protest movements who were in their neighborhood and who had blocked part of the street. I think the worry here is that this is awakening a sort of vigilante justice that has had a history in Colombia in the past. And as frustration, particularly with the blockades, grows among economic sectors that are mostly affected by them, the risk is that this sort of violence could expand if it's not controlled and investigated in the way that is transparent and open.
And who are these vigilantes?
So we don't know exactly at the moment. It's interesting that some of the violence has taken place around one single neighborhood in Cali. This neighborhood is generally home to wealthier individuals. And in Cali, let's think about the context of Cali, the city itself. It's a city where class differences are extremely visible and marked. And so this area of the city is particularly wealthy and has been very frustrated by the economic blockade and the roadblocks that have been put up throughout the city. I was in Cali last week, and essentially the way that this works is around 2, 3, 4 in the afternoon, protesters will start to block key roads that limit access in and out of neighborhoods. The place where these incidents of violence happened, again, it's called Ciudad Jardín, is a place where indigenous protesters originally, but then others subsequently have blocked entrances to the neighborhood in a way that really frustrated the community. That's not, of course, however, an excuse to be taking violence into their own hands.
Not an excuse. You mentioned that Cali, the epicenter of these protests, now more than a month old, is a place where the inequality is visible.
That's right. So Cali, its identity really encapsulates, I think, a lot of the reasons that we've seen these protests erupt. Rising income inequality in one of the most unequal countries already in Latin America, extreme effects from the pandemic. In Cali, the number of people living in extreme poverty nearly tripled in just the span of a year last year. So you have racial differences, class differences, all very marked, and also a sense that there's this exclusionary system that really limits social mobility, so that if you grow up in one of the neighborhoods that is less privileged, you won't even have the opportunity to access higher education and the job market in the same way that a similar individual in a different neighborhood might be able to. And I think the impact of the pandemic is really clear here, because the ground was already laid in 2019 when similar protests about social inequality erupted. But again, the pandemic made all those things viscerally clear. For example, the impact of the health crisis itself. It made clear what are the stakes of being part of the society that doesn't have access to healthcare. Those in the lower income groups in Cali in particular, but also in the rest of the country, were far more likely to be hospitalized and to die of COVID than those in the upper income groups. So this is a sort of fundamentally visual and visceral demonstration of the inequality in the city.
Yeah, so the pandemic fueling what we can sort of label a class warfare in this instance. Doesn't bode well, does it, for next year's presidential election, where for the first time, since ever, the left has a credible shot at winning? Will that mean that there'll be those who have those guns doubling down?
Well, listen, I think something that is very important to point out, again, when I was in Cali last week, protesters were very adamant that they aren't on the street to support any specific political candidate. This is really a protest against the entire elite political class that has been so exclusionary for so long. And I think this is also really an indication of frustration, not just with the political class, but also with the security forces. Something that's been very pronounced in Cali, but as well as through the rest of Colombia, is this broken relationship between the community and the security forces. crisis. We've seen instances of documented abuse by the police, particularly in Cali, where the vast majority, more than 80% of the casualties during the protests, as many as 46, according to the government ombudsman, have taken place. So this relationship is broken and really, again, is the other component fueling these protests. How does this feed into the election? In my view, the main impact, frankly, is that it makes it a lot harder to find a way out of this crisis, because no one has the political courage to step into a negotiating position where they might take concessions or where they might give and take a little bit in a way that could hurt their electoral results going forward. So unfortunately, we have a context that is already explosive, many legitimate grievances coming forward, and a political class that is worried and nervous and instrumentalizing, let's say, the protest in order for in hopes of its own political gain.
All right, and this call for police reform, which you say is at the heart of it all. I'll read you what the Reuters news agency says, because you now have the deployment of the military since last Friday. Inhabitants reacting with fear and suspicion to the sight of soldiers patrolling the streets. Others, though, have been cheering them. What are your thoughts about the fact that now the government's deployed the military?
So since the beginning of this crisis, I think we can say that the government has really viewed it as a problem of law and order. So that this is a sort of law enforcement problem. Unfortunately, it's not. It's a political crisis. And so their response in terms of sending more security forces to the street has really had in many ways a detrimental effect in terms of radicalizing some segments of the protest, but also instilling a sense that the government really hasn't taken this situation seriously. Now, in terms of the military deployment, it's been quite interesting, because essentially what has happened is that the government has authorized the military to assist the police in controlling protests and preventing vandalism, opening up roads, things like this. But local authorities in many areas, for example, in Caquetá and also in Santander, two departments where there have been significant protests, have said that they would prefer not to use the military, that they would prefer to continue to negotiate with protesters directly and find a different way out. So there is a reluctance, I think, from those who are on the ground dealing with the situation at a sort of local molecular level to escalate into a broader use of force. Whereas the government, I think, growing impatient, particularly with roadblocks, has sought to utilize the armed forces in that way.
And just one final question on this. I hope this doesn't sound callous as a question, but is there a difference between the soldiers and the police, seeing as the police in Colombia don't answer to the Interior Ministry, but to the Defense Ministry?
Yeah, so I think in terms of both the way that they behave, but also the roles that they manage, there is a significant difference. So police, of course, are sort of the daily community security type forces that you would imagine any police force in any country. And so as a result of that, I think the relationship between the police and the community in places like Cali is quite conflictive. There are reports, for example, in many of the neighborhoods where there are protests of stigmatization of kids who grow up in low-income neighborhoods, assuming that they're members of criminal groups, corruption among the police. These are the sorts of things that have damaged the reputation of the police. And so then again, when the riot squad, which is part of the police, has been implicated in police abuse during the protests, it's really damaged even further their relationship. The military is much more withdrawn from that day-to-day context, also much more focused on issues of rural security, fighting armed groups. And so in general, I think that their reception among civilians in the city is a little bit more distant, and as a result could have the potential to be a bit more trusting, at least initially.
Elizabeth Dickinson of Crisis Group, many thanks for speaking with us from Bogota.
I appreciate it. Thank you.